Good morning and welcome to Last Month in Criminal Justice, our monthly webinar programme reviewing criminal justice developments in the previous month. Today and this morning we'll be talking about criminal justice developments in May. We're going to be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on the criminal justice system. We're going to be talking about the latest developments in the long-running, indeed interminably long-running undercover policing inquiry. We're going to be asking the question, should the police prosecute those stealing food to survive the cost of living crisis? A kind of a controversial issue which became a bit of an area of dispute between senior police officers and senior politicians during the course of May. We're going to be talking about the prison education system. Is it chaotic? And we're going to be talking about joint enterprise and latest developments in this ongoing issue around unfair convictions under joint enterprise doctrine. And we're going to be starting by talking about the experience of care experienced women and girls in the criminal justice system and in prison in particular. We have a great panel joining us this morning to chew over all these issues. First, we're joined by Dr. Claire Fitzpatrick, who's a senior lecturer at Lancaster University. Hello, Claire. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Richard.
We have Mark Johnson, MBE, who's the founder and chief executive officer of User Voice. Hello, Mark. Lovely to join us. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Richard.
And we have my colleague Helen Mills, who's the head of programs at the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies. Hello, Helen, and thank you for joining. If you would like to pose a question during the course of the programme, there's the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom or the top of your Zoom app, I think, depending on whether you're on Microsoft or Windows or other operating systems. And you can pose a question. If there's a question that you see that you think is really interesting, you can also, and of course they'll all be very interesting, I'm sure, but you can upvote questions that you'd be particularly keen to hear. And the more upvotes they get, the more likely they are that we'll be able to pose them to the panel. And finally, we'll be running through the order of the programme in the order I just gave. And so what that means is if, for example, you want to pose a question or ask a question around care experienced women and girls in custody, this will be a good time to start thinking about those questions. In about 10 or 15 minutes, we'll move on to the impact of COVID-19 on the criminal justice system. And again, get your questions in around that sort of time. If towards the end of the programme you suddenly have a burning question on COVID-19, we're probably not going to be able to get back to it because the conversation will have moved on by then. So do get your questions in early. So without further ado, let's start with the challenging and very sort of important issue of care experience of women and girls in the criminal justice system. And I'll start with a quote from Josie, a former female prisoner with a background in care. We just threw out them gates, got to walk over there so you can get a bus, haven't got nowhere to live, back out on the streets. And that was a comment that Josie, a female prisoner, gave to the researchers who put together this new report. It was researchers from Lancaster University, Liverpool John Moores University, and the University of Bristol, and they spoke to 54 care experienced and women and girls, as well as policy leads and frontline practitioners for the report that came out on the 4th of May, Disrupting the Roots Between Care and Custody for Girls and Women. Many of those interviewed described multiple experiences of abuse, serious violence and trauma, and the report highlighted unnecessary criminalisation and the immense harm that it caused. Also in May, a report from the Prison Inspectorate on Bronzefield Women's and Girls Prison found that 65% of prisoners were leaving prison without safe and sustainable accommodation. It also highlighted cuts to domestic abuse and resettlement support. Now, I'm delighted that one of the authors of the report that came out earlier this month, Disrupting the Roots Between Care and Custody, Claire Fitzpatrick, is with us this morning. Claire, thank you so much for joining us. Let's start with a question which I often kind of wonder, and I'm sure I'm not alone. Do do female prisoners and sort of women and girls in the criminal justice system more broadly, do they get a particularly raw deal when it comes to release and resettlement support?
Hi, Richard. Great to be here today. Yeah, in terms of girls and women, I'd say that absolutely they do get a raw deal. Their needs have tended to be neglected in research, policy and practice. They're fewer in number within the system. So that's one of the reasons for that. But we have less provision. So in the case of those who are in prison, for example, they are often placed very long distances from home, which can make it far more difficult to maintain contact with friends, family, community. What our Nuffield Foundation funded research has shown is that these issues may be exacerbated for those who have spent time in the care system as children. One of the key aims of this work was very much about drawing and learning from the experiences of those with first-hand experience of care and custody, amplifying the voices of those rarely heard who are often beyond the gaze of the community and are easily forgotten about, particularly if they go into prison. And really what we found is that for many of those with a care background, had multiple experiences of prior disadvantage, had often been failed by various systems before coming into the criminal justice system, and frequently felt abandoned by their local authorities, who obviously is a role in the state as corporate parent, has certain duties, certainly to those of a particular age. And that, you know, those feelings of abandonment, I think, have been highlighted in previous research. And although there has been some progress, absolutely something that came through strongly in our work. And just thinking what one young woman I spoke to said, they literally just washed their hands of me. Very much some of those feelings still felt very strongly. And we've heard some very powerful and heartbreaking accounts actually of some of those who actually felt safer within the prison environment, which is a damning indictment of the support that may be available out there in the community.
And you say that some progress has been made. I mean, and I'm probably guilty of this, of kind of just feeling that it just either seems to be just the same old stuff going round and round and round and nothing seems to change, or, you know, the situation is getting worse. And indeed, in some ways, you know, there are, you know, definitely some areas where things are getting worse. But you say things have changed for the better. So, I mean, I'm not trying to be, you know, kind of funny here. What do you think have been some of the improvements over recent years?
So, yeah, so I mean, change for the better. Some progress has been made in the sense that I guess when I was doing my PhD over 20 years ago now.
You don't look old enough to have done a PhD 20 years ago.
That's very kind. No one was talking about care experience in prisons. It simply wasn't on the agenda. What we have got now is some work going on to actively try and deal with these issues, where we know that a bunch of individuals have often been abandoned and neglected, particularly by local authorities, and particularly if they're still entitled to leaving care support under what is the relatively narrow limits of the law. There's real challenges there. Things have not got better nearly as much as they need to get better. Some of the quotes that we've heard in this recent research that myself and my colleagues Katie Hunter, Joe Staines and Julie Shaw have been involved in are deeply depressing, and some of them reflect the exact experiences that were reported over 20 years ago in research I was involved in, and research that had been done in the decades previously. Like Pat Carlin talked about these issues back in the 1980s, putting these issues on the agenda. So I guess, to be clear, not nearly enough has changed. Much more needs to change, but there is an agenda now within the prison system to try and address these issues and improve support and improve connections and communication with local authorities. There's also an agenda to try and divert children away from unnecessary criminalisation in the youth justice system at an earlier stage. Now, there's some great work happening in some areas, but it's not consistent across the country. So there's still a lot of ground that needs to be made up there, notwithstanding, you know, the really important work that is going on by some committed practitioners.
And yeah, oh, sorry, Helen. Yes, please.
That's right. I was going to say, I think one of the things, you know, certainly the last few years has kind of shown us is that it's one thing for issues to be recognised, but quite another to feel that they're being acted on. And I know we're kind of talking about several issues here. There's the care issue, there's the women leaving prison. So just to go with the women leaving prison, you know, we can go back to 2018 and the female offender strategy, which, you know, very much makes the case for diversion, for improved resettlement. You then, I think very recently, a few months ago, had the National Audit Report about the women offenders strategy, which said there's no action plan here, no clear resources here, there's no targets here. It's really unclear what progress means in practice about this plan. And I think what the Bronzefield report that you referenced before, Richard, you know, an inspectorate report into a women's prison, is what seems to have really changed, kind of thinking about the last few years, is the staff cuts. So I think a statistic from that report was, in the resettlement team in the prison, of the 10 places for resettlement staff, only 4 were filled. And this sort of came back to me yesterday because we were having an office sort out, and I found a report that my colleague Roger and other colleagues had worked on about women leaving Holloway prison. That was in 2013, and it described the situation in terms of resettlement support and housing in particular as dire at the time. And showing the report and talking about today with Roger yesterday, that now seems like a high point, because it has undoubtedly got worse in terms of resourcing.
And one of the really harrowing stories in that earlier report was which is really stuck in my mind, is it was a woman who was was basically kicked out of Holloway with nowhere to go, ended up living or sleeping in a cupboard in a crack house, and a month on actually did finally get accommodation, and amazingly actually managed to kind of get out of that situation, which I suppose tells you a lot about the resilience also of some people in those situations, prisoners who kind of just left to fend for themselves and have to make the best of it, and amazing people with great resilience in many ways.
Yeah. Well, I think that the stat from the inspectorate report was that 2/3 of the women who were leaving that prison did not have stable accommodation to go to, if that's defined as having accommodation for more than 12 weeks. What the report also, I think, usefully said is this statistic isn't shockingly new. You know, you can go back at previous inspectorate reports, or frankly, you know, look more broadly across the population. I remember the inspectorate report around short-term prisoners leaving custody a couple of years ago had a very similar statistic, again, particular problems in London around the availability of accommodation. What was just new was that they'd invested some resource in identifying what that statistic was, but you know, it's not that is shockingly new.
I think far more needs to change, without a doubt. I think people on the care experience side, people are talking about care experience in a way that didn't seem to be the case. But one of the things that we argue really strongly in our recent report is the need for resources, the need for more staffing, the need for support for staff and so on, to make sure that these kinds of issues that are being talked about can actually lead to real change on the ground and actually have a difference in real people's lives, rather than sort of remaining as part of policy documents and so on. So there's definitely something about that policy to making a difference at the practice level, connection or disconnection or disjoint here. There is a huge challenge, especially with resettlement, which is dire. Yeah.
And one of the recommendations of your report is there needs to be, much more of a focus on community alternatives, really trying to kind of prevent people being sent to, women and girls being sent to prison unnecessarily. I mean, there's an argument whether any women and girls should be sent to prison. That's a broader argument. Mark, maybe I could just bring you in at this point, and just thinking about the work that you and colleagues do through Use a Voice. I mean, and pose it in this way. I mean, we sometimes talk about the so-called school to prisons pipeline, which is a particular frame, sort of a theme that's come from America. The idea that kids are just basically failed in schools and then just set up for ending up in prison. I kind of wonder whether what Claire's and colleagues' report has demonstrated is there's also a bit of a care to prisons pipeline. And I'm just wondering, in your work with Use a Voice, I mean, you must have come across care experienced and care leaver prisoners and ex-prisoners as well in your work.
Well, we work daily in Bronzefield prison, so with the women, and I mean, generally this issue is not just gender specific. Obviously the work that you've done, Claire, is specific on, it's taken an example of it, but we kind of know, this link between, social exclusion, care is one of them. The really interesting part is if you speak to people about what their definition of care is, we use this, like they've got this pseudo like sort of language. It doesn't even make sense. It's not even in the Oxford Dictionary's definition of what care means. It's like a social, you know what I mean, policy speak, academic type speak. But the one thing's for sure, the link is very clear. The really dangerous part is when this work has been conducted in inspector reports, etc. We've had COVID come with extreme levels of staff shortages, extreme removal of any opportunities to change education, support, etc. Large numbers of breaches reoccurring, so women coming out of prison being breached and sent back in, not being able to go to court, never mind education. And now we've got the talk of restricted regimes and personal activity, so less time at cell, lost opportunity to change. The big elephant in the room for me here is we don't teach people personal resilience, and it's a word you use, Richard. So we don't arm these people, women, people in general, with the facts about themselves. When I speak to kids and stuff that have been in care, I'd really tell them the truth and say, look, you're part of a group that's predisposed to be a prostitute, a drug addict, the rest of your life in prison, dead, yeah, or having a complete miserable perpetuation of your kids going into care and prison as well. There's no opportunities for these discussions to occur in prison because there's a skills deficit. So we can call for more staff, we can call for this, but unless you get to the true causes behind it, and that is, look at neurodiversity, yeah, clinical diagnosis of some of these kids that from school, or the ones that never got diagnosis that ended up in care. So all this kind of stuff that we need to consider in this, but there's a central truth to it for me, and that is is arming people with the facts about themselves. Do you know what I mean? And if you can do that, you can say, look, no one's going to help you. So use this opportunity right now to use your resilience that you've used to survive this far in your chaotic life to change and give them responsibility to do that.
Thank you, Mark. We need to draw this item to a close in a minute, but Claire, let me just come back to you and kind of put back a point that Mark just made, which kind of in one sense quite I think sort of an energizing vision, helping, prisoners and released prisoners to kind of, as it were, be more resilient, to be able to kind of have the resources to, to make their way. But nobody's there to help you is also quite a sort of a bleak, I suspect a very grounded assessment of the reality of the situation, but nonetheless a very bleak situation. How do we kind of get to a situation where, those with the care backgrounds and indeed other vulnerable prisoners, but we're talking about care experienced prisoners here, that that they get a rather better deal than they currently do, and which isn't just about personal resilience, however important that is.
Yeah. Just on the resilience thing, it makes me think of some of the great work that the Care Leavers Association, a user-led charity led by the late Darren Coyne, were involved in not so long ago, in empowerment programs. Clear Approach was the name of a particular intervention that myself and colleague Patrick Williams were involved in evaluating, which had a real impact actually on those who were in that time, young men on an intensive alternative to custody order. But I think there's absolutely something that sort of links, I think, with Mark's point about resilience on these empowerment programs and the importance of sort of being mentored and learning from others with lived experience who've come through those systems. In terms of the point about how do we get to a different place, I think there's a number of things we should be doing. First of all, diversion at an early point in the system. We need to be keeping more kids out of the youth justice system, preventing the unnecessary criminalisation of those in care. We know that too many continue to be under official surveillance in a way that isn't the case for other children without a care status. If we want to be a little bit more imaginative, things like raising the age of criminal responsibility would serve to keep more younger children out of the youth justice system in the first place and bring us more into line with our European neighbours. One of the things we also argue for in our report is making the unnecessary criminalisation of children in care a statutory duty. There was a cross-government protocol published back in 2018 on this, but it has no statutory status. I think by making that a statutory duty and raising the minimum age of criminal responsibility, you've got a real sort of combination of factors that could help with diverting kids away. But I'd also add that we shouldn't be abandoning those who are already in the system right now, who are so easily forgotten about. And there, I think, although I think we should be keeping women out of prison wherever possible and developing our community alternatives, there's something about making sure that we're providing support for those who are experiencing the pains of imprisonment right now.
Can I just, I know you want to, I know we're ready to move on.
Go on, be quick.
I'm going to sneak in with one thing, because I noticed that last month also published was an independent review of children's social care, and that made, you know, a number of recommendations, as you can imagine, but two that I think might be particularly relevant to our audience. I appreciate we haven't really got time to go into them, but they caught my eye. One was a recommendation that care experience should be a protected characteristic, and two was that youth justice policy should move from the Ministry of Justice to the Department of Education.
Thank you. We've had a kind of a question and comment from Roger Grimshaw, actually one of our other colleagues at the centre. The NHS has been talking about trauma-informed systems which address adverse experiences and seek to promote resilience. How can the criminal justice system respond positively to that agenda? What are the shifts required? We don't have time to answer that right now, but I think let's leave that one hanging, but we may well come back in the course of the programme to some of the themes implied in that question. But time is always against us with this. We try to pack quite a bit into each programme. We've got 6 items to get through. So I think at this point we should move on to the next item, which is on COVID-19 and the impact of COVID-19 on the criminal justice system. A new report by 5 criminal justice inspection bodies out last month warns that the criminal justice system in England and Wales risks a disjointed and fractured recovery from COVID-19 lockdown. Quoting from the report here, the impact of the pandemic on the criminal justice system was unprecedented. However, now that restrictions have eased, some parts of the criminal justice system are not responding quickly enough to reverse changes or restore performance to pre-pandemic levels. In prisons, for example, the report notes, spending 22.5 hours a day locked in their cell is not unusual, nor is having to choose between completing basic domestic tasks or exercising. Now, later this month, User Voice will be publishing a report, Coping with COVID, of prisoners' experiences, and it's based on the experiences of some 1,400 prisoners. It's going to be one of the biggest studies of prison life under COVID-19 ever undertaken. And I'm delighted that Mark Johnson from User Voice is able to join us today to talk about the issues around COVID-19 in prisons. Mark, I realise your report is not published yet, so I appreciate there are things you can't necessarily say about the report at this stage. So any kind of preview you can give us today would be lovely, of course. But let's maybe just start with, you know, this kind of sense of prisoners in their cells, 22.5 hours a day plus. This was, you know, very much the
23 3/4 hours up to.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, it's almost literally all the time, apart from very quick break. Let's get straight into it then. I mean, you know, I've been around in this field for a long time, as have you. You know, certainly my experience in the past has been that prisoners spend many hours in their cells even before COVID anyway. So how different was the experience of imprisonment during the COVID lockdown compared with what went before?
Well, it's in the history of British prison, it's never been more severe. The confinement has never been more severe. I've noticed yesterday the Guardian article with the inspectorate report, it kind of minimises a lot. Do you know what I mean? About it says boredom, but actually, if you look at the definition of torture, if you look at the rule 44 in the UN Convention of the Mandela ruling, actually, about 22 hours being like a kind of bar for anything beyond as being inhumane. And yet we've got 85% of people reporting that they were in their cell out of their cell for an hour or less during COVID. So that's intermittently over 2 years. So the worst part's fully, the rest of it. And what I'll add to this is the nuances that working user-led offer is prisoners count time, not the 24-hour clock. And one of the insights were actually it's 27 hours that you're banged up. So from sometimes when your doors open for half an hour, you've got to go to healthcare, use the phone with the whole wing, 120 people, 2 phones are broken, do a purple visit that people have to be there, sat centrally, and nothing can go wrong, otherwise you lose your time, and then back in your cell within that time frame. It's horrific, yeah. And if you look at the international stats, India, for instance, released 66,000 people. Iran and Iraq, 20% of their prison population. France, which had 70,000 people up, released 20% of their prison when COVID hit. Why did they do that? Because they know that prisons were the epicenter of viral transmissions. We know that historically. We also know the impact on severe isolation as well for human beings. You know, internationally, it's been researched, and yet the decision that was made uncreatively was that the court stopped sending people to prison. The numbers dropped to 4,000. I think the early release scheme was to release 4,000 of the most vulnerable. They stopped that scheme. It got stopped at 275 people. And they said the argument's been that there was a natural, because there's no inflow of the courts, there was a natural drop, and because they had an established healthcare system, that they made the decision to basically lock people up, basically isolate everybody. And that is no visits, no family visits, you know, these extreme levels. I mean, we'll talk about probably isolation, education in a while, but, you know, using these distraction packs of colouring books, giving entry-level English without any kind of allocation, 70% of people reporting of no in-person cell visit during that time. And then even now reporting that regimes are not back to anywhere near normal. And so working on this project, I mean, it's the best thing that I've ever done. It's the most harrowing thing that I've ever done. We worked in 10 prisons. You know, you said about being sensitive about the information that we released. The ESRC funded this, and it was on the proviso of being solution focused, of doing the work and giving the information back to save lives and help people. So in those 10 prisons, we reported back to the prison governors immediately, so they could build in any kind of immediate solutions. Then Gold Command at the MOJ and HMPPS were informed all the way through this project. So we hope that it's a you know, collaborative, but you know, the truth. And before everybody moves on to things like, oh well, my grandma was isolated and couldn't go out to the doctors, or I couldn't see them. This is very different, very, very different. And whichever way you look at it, I mean, if you were the man in the street that didn't care about criminal justice, didn't want to know, here's the thing, okay? 83,000 people were locked up under the most extreme situations ever over the last 2 years, right? The 2 functions of prison is confinement, removal from society. The next part is rehabilitation. We can categorically prove that rehabilitation opportunities never occurred throughout the last 2 years. So there's a cohort of men and women that are getting out in our society that are literally reporting. So here's the 2 lines and I'll shut up. We used PHQ-9 score and GAD-7 score, and I'm not going to begin to explain what that is, but the academic Shad Maruna, he knows, and actually the inspectorate were really interested in using that score. The self-reporting was over 70% of people scored themselves to moderate to severe depression, and that term will hide a multitude of. So basically, if you're in a doctor's surgery, filled out their form, he'd be putting you on medication or referring you to treatment. And the worrying thing is, this cohort of people are coming out in our society and nobody's preparing for it, never mind acknowledging it. Everybody's talking about recovery, but the recovery, I have to say, is more of a restricted regime. Why is that? Because the system is saying, oh, violence has dropped, self-harm's dropped. It hasn't. And I can clearly, the report really talks about that, about being tooed up in your cell with somebody that you don't know for extreme levels of time. Violence definitely hasn't dropped. It's just not being reported properly. Mm-hmm. So the term, what you said, what's being present, I'd say that it's chaos. And I find it really worrying that we've got some state-run institutions who have confined people for extreme levels of time, that there's a belligerent denial that this has had a real impact on the people who harm. And what's more, they want to do more confinement coming out of it. I find that really worrying. I don't see how it protects the public in any way, shape or form.
And we in the last program of this series, we discussed the independent advisory panel on deaths in custody, written to the Secretary of State calling for an urgent review of sort of mental health impact of COVID lockdown. And certainly when I spoke to a panel member just last week, they said that they still haven't received even an acknowledgement or a response from government. No. I was asking, maybe the response has come since, but I think your kind of your phrase there, Mark, belligerent denial, is a really kind of striking one. I mean, one of the things that it's become almost a cliche coming out of lockdown, as it were, is that everything's changed. People's working practices change. I mean, we're looking at us all. We're all, I think, probably broadcasting from home this morning without kind of making any assumptions about that. And we're all kind of fairly used to these kinds of things, the Zoom things, Microsoft Teams, and other kind of networking stuff. And so society has changed quite a lot, working practices, but prisons just seem stuck. Nothing. I mean, as you say, they went into a very extreme lockdown, and there are some real fears at the moment, I think, that that's going to be the new norm.
Well, the elephant in the room, Richard, is that the Inspectorate report talked about it yesterday about staff shortages. And there's a convenience here that staff shortages and locking prisoners up, right, reduce the need for having more staff. Okay, and prisoner isolation has been the consequence for that staff shortage. And with the governors that I've spoke to on record, we cannot lock people up and with any kind of decency with the numbers that we've got, both in prison and the levels of staff. And it's as simple as that. And here's the other thing, and I will shut up, is these are state regulated bodies. So what is the function of, and my aim of this report is that we bloody talk about criminal justice, because what prisons do, they're places of confinement. They're clearly, and Claire said it as well, they're not places that set people up to not commit the same bloody crimes as they committed before going in. There's even no inquiry half the time about what people done. And then there's this anecdotal polarization and media drip feed of that it's work that's needed or vocational and maths and English education. It's not. And we've got to learn from, I hope, from the voices contained within this report. This is such an innovative approach to providing the world with the truth, basically. And what it does do is it opens up an argument to say what the state narrative has been, there's a saying, is a huge disc to talk about it.
Claire, can I just bring you in? I mean, you obviously your research looking at care experience from the girl, I'm not sure whether it overlapped at all with the COVID lockdown and whether you came across some of the issues that Mark's been talking about, or did that, was it prior to that?
Okay, and I think the work Mark's talking about sounds incredibly important to get out there to show what has been going on. In terms of our interviews with in-prison women, they actually just finished before the COVID lockdown, as the COVID lockdown was starting. Our interviews with girls and young women in the community, our interviews with police youth justice, the judiciary and so on, moved online as a result of COVID. So we effectively had sort of discussions like we're having now, using Teams or Zoom and so on. But those, those in-prison experiences were really reporting experiences that were just prior to COVID. I do think this is such important stuff though. And especially I think COVID can become a very easy excuse actually to overlook problems that were already there in all various levels of the justice system, you know, not least the court system, the huge delays. We hear sort of COVID being talked about as a problem, but actually a lot of this stuff was happening before. And it's, it really, really important to expose some of this. And thinking too, actually, of some of the really important work coming out of the Alliance for Youth Justice and Manchester Met University, who've looked at children and the impact of them being locked up through COVID recently, and sort of that being held in solitary confinement, in breach of kind of human rights and so on. I mean, it's a devastating picture.
Thank you. We need to move on. But Mark, your report is due out. Well, I think you've got a launch next Tuesday, the 16th. Is that right? Is that is that just a private launch? Or
no, it's an online workshop, so everybody's invited on the 14th. The details are on uservoice.org website.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll share the and so we'll share the details of that with the attendees today, and if they want to follow up on it, and obviously the report will be available to read in due course. So thank you for that. Some really sort of interesting thoughts here. There's a question or observation in the chat from Malcolm. Hasn't the COVID Act given the government a new weapon based on function creep and suppressing protests and challenge? And I can see already some nods in there amongst the panelists there. So I think we'll leave that question hanging, as it were, but an important question. We need to move on to our next item, which is on the undercover policing inquiry. Now, over 7 years ago, the then Home Secretary, Theresa May, you might remember her, announced a public inquiry into undercover policing. The purpose, according to the inquiry website, was, quote, to get to the truth about undercover policing across England and Wales since 1968 and provide recommendations for the future. Last month, so 7 years on or so, and with over £50 million already spent, the inquiry finally held its first in-person evidence hearings. The next round of evidence hearings are not due to start until the spring of 2024, not 23, not 22, spring of 2024, which is a timetable described by the campaign group Police Spies Out of Lives as beyond belief. Now, during last month's evidence sessions, the inquiry heard that dozens of officers infiltrated the Socialist Worker Party from the 1970s on, while senior officers decided against infiltrating far-right groups during the same period. The inquiry also heard that the Crown Prosecution Service had decided against prosecuting an officer who stole a dead baby's identity, as it was not in the public interest to do so. The revelation came too late for the baby's mother, Barbara Shaw, who died last year. Now, my colleague Helen Mills, who joins us today, did some research around the undercover policing a few years ago now, and I'm delighted that she's able to join us today to talk about sort of more recent developments. Helen, what's behind? I mean, it does seem like the inquiry is just taking forever and ever to get anywhere. Is this down to just the sheer scope and size of its task? And it's just taking a long time? Is it establishment stonewalling? Is there some attempt to cover up going on here? Why is the inquiry taking so long? Or is it indeed? Is that how long these things take?
Well, I think the two reasons you just given there aren't mutually exclusive in my book, and I'm sure the reality is that there's something of both going on. I'm not going to seek to sort of defend the timetable, but I do think it's explicable. So some of the reasons why it's taken so long, well, first of all, as you say, the scope is massive of this inquiry. It goes back to events covering 1968 onwards. If you compare that, for example, to the Bloody Sunday inquiry, which looked at the events of one day, that inquiry ended up taking 12 years to get to its final report. I think a second reason is the complexity, and much of this is for the first time and unique to this kind of inquiry, of holding a public inquiry about a secret issue, undercover policing, and how you kind of work your way through that. So one of the, I think the main reasons that the inquiry is as delayed as it is, if you think about its original, I think 3-year timescale was the original one Theresa May gave, is that it spent a significant period of time dealing with the anonymity of undercover officers. So if every undercover officer was offered the opportunity to give evidence anonymously, they all applied individually for this. They were all judged, you know, it was all those cases were judged on their individual merits. I think most of them have been given anonymity. That took an awfully long amount of time. I mean, other reasons are, you know, the sheer scale of the information is kind of mind-boggling. I mean, this is a tactic that is about intelligence gathering, right? So it's not entirely surprising that there is vast files. I think the Met originally at the start of the inquiry, or towards the start of the inquiry, handed over 1 million documents to the inquiry. There are over 1,000 groups who are involved as core participants in the inquiry. There's, I think, about 130 something undercover officers who've been called to give evidence, who've been recognised by the inquiry. And I think, as you say, the police have been criticised throughout for delaying. I mean, I don't know, you know, you remember that kind of the phrase just before the inquiry, neither confirm nor deny, and how long that kind of ran for. And this is sort of seen as a continuation of that. So I think they're kind of some of the reasons. I also think it's probably just worth saying, as an external observer, it's hard to keep on top of an inquiry like this and what's been kind of going on. So just in terms, because there's an opportunity for me to kind of touch base with it again, in terms of where it's got to. So the inquiry's now been split up into stages, and where we've got to is the end of the first tranche, which is why there's a gap, part of the reason why there's a gap to the next set of evidence sessions. So there's been 3 evidence sessions, but as you say, only 1 in person, but that's because of COVID. The other 2 were just held virtually. And it's been split up chronologically. So I think where we've got to is they've looked so far at 1968 to 1982. And last month, what happened was in that 3rd tranche, that evidence session, was all about SDS, so Special Demonstration Squad, which is the name of the undercover unit police at the time, the managers that would have given the justification and the rationale for these missions. It was them that were being called as witnesses. So that's what kind of happened last month. And there were a couple of things that I sort of picked up as a kind of interesting, I suppose, about this. One was the opening statement that was given by the police's legal team, because I think it's interesting to see what the defence of these tactics might be. And I think what sort of maybe being suggested in that statement is 3 things I picked up. Was one, that we cannot, this is the legal team for the police speaking here, we can't judge these missions by a modern standpoint. So one case it makes in relation to this period we've heard about is this was the 1960s and 1970s and the early 1980s. Is it racist? Is it misogynistic? Yes, because those institutions we know were at the time. So it's no surprise that the decisions made by these units simply reflected their institutions. We can't judge this by a modern standpoint. And the second is that we can't really, it wouldn't be fair to assess these missions in terms of outcome, because I think justification and why they took place and why the level of infiltration took place is kind of a key remit of the inquiry. So one thing that the legal team tried to argue was that we need to focus on reasoning at the time that senior officers have had for authorising these missions, whether they actually had any outcomes in terms of crime or public order or otherwise. Well, they couldn't have really known that at the time, could they? That seems a very unfair criteria to apply. And the third was that, you know, these practices were not unique to this one unit that we're looking at. They were actually used across various undercover units that use undercover, like MI5 and indeed in other countries. Practices like using dead children's names are not unique to the
that sort of opens up a whole new can of worms, you know. I mean, I sort of hesitate to say maybe we need a wider inquiry, you know, but well,
I think, yeah, I mean, usefully on that point, the judge did say that, you know, the purpose of this inquiry is the SDS. We are going to stick there. I'm not going to widen it out to other organisations. He also questioned the legal team of the police because they compare on that use of deceased children's names. They said, well, the KGB did this, and he did respond to them to say, I'm not sure you want to be comparing yourself to the KGB, and you might just want to think about your statement there.
But I mean, it's interesting that the police were saying, well, you know, yeah, in the past, yeah, well, we know the police were racist and, you know, sexist and misogynist and homophobic, but, you know, that was then, this is now. And of course, you know, we know, we've covered it in previous editions of this programme. You know, the Mayor of London, for example, has highlighted what he considers to be, you know, deep misogyny, racism, sexism in the Metropolitan Police. And of course, only a few months ago, we had the scandal of these secret recordings from, you know, Charing Cross Police Station, you know, some deeply, well, no, it wasn't recorded, it was WhatsApp messages, wasn't it? Some deeply unpleasant behaviour. So it seems a bit odd for the Met to suggest, well, that was then. And, you know, of course, we're now, you know, we're all terribly sort of intersectional and, you know, kind of race aware and all the rest, because that doesn't.
Yeah, I thought it was a kind of, you know, it was an interesting change in the tactic from, well, this is actually just about individual officers and rotten apples, which I think is a defence you often hear around policing before is, well, you know, for many years, people have been very keen to talk about the institutional issues in policing and felt they were overlooked in favour of individualising events. And this very much turns that around and says, oh no, this is an institutional problem, so let's not, you know, seek to blame a unit here.
I mean, let's just I mean, we've got this judge-led inquiry. I think it's going to be running potentially for several more years. And,
Yes.
you know, as you say, there's a huge amount of paperwork to get through. And even if one doesn't assume that, you know, one of the best ways of hiding things in public is just to blizzard the inquiry with paperwork, you know, everything from relevant stuff to, you know, staff canteen menus and photocopier manuals. And let's assume maybe, hopefully the police aren't doing that. But nonetheless, you know, I mean, if the point is to get to the truth of the matter, not least of all for those who were spied on, do we not, without being more, you know, morbid about it, do we not risk a situation by the time the report finally materializes, quite a few of those who were affected will have, to put it bluntly, would have died, actually. And, you know, in that context, are judge-led inquiries really an effective way to get to the truth on matters like this? I don't know. I mean, what do you think, Helen? Is it?
Yeah, I think, you know, I don't have a sense of what the ideal is here. What I would say is that what I like about certainly a public inquiry model, whether it's judge-led or not, is its power to subpoena evidence and compel witnesses. Neither of which are, as we know from this inquiry so far, necessarily mean that, you know, that's a perfect way to get all the information you want, nor necessarily will, you know, all the witnesses be perhaps as helpful as you might want them to be, or as transparent as one might want them to be. But I think that what is good about that is the disclosures that might come along the way, no matter what the kind of reporting of, you know, because we don't know yet, you know, obviously what the judge will find and what it will report, you know, what he will report. What I would just say on that though is one of the reasons for the gap is that there is going to be an interim report sometime between now and 2024 on the inquiry so far, which I at least think is helpful rather than us waiting. As you say, this is going to run for years yet, rather than us kind of feel like we can't say very much at all until we see the report. I don't know what the alternatives are. I mean, the obvious thing that sprang to my mind was the Hillsborough inquiry and its use of a panel, an independent panel. And I know that's something that you know, various groups who are core participants in this inquiry put forward as the preferred model. You know, you can imagine the kinds of skills you might want on that panel: archivists, researchers, people with policing expertise. You know, obviously it's not they chose to go with the judge-led, but I mean that would to me perhaps have been preferable to have a panel. I don't know that it would have shortened this inquiry, or how one would go about shortening this quite complex inquiry.
It may have also meant greater legitimacy, because of course one of the issues is that the core participants, you know, which is basically code for individuals and organizations who were probably spied on, you know, a number of them have effectively boycotted or, you know, threatened to boycott the inquiry, saying they just don't have trust in the outcome. So it remains, I suspect, it's something that I'm sure we'll want to come back to in future editions of this program. And the whole issue about police accountability and what is acceptable and unacceptable police behaviour in a democratic society, so called, I think is, it's not just about police spying, but certainly police spying is one of the, the kind of the rub points at the centre of these debates. All right, let's move on to our next item. In a while, we're going to be talking about prison education. And then we're going to finish with an update on where we are with the campaign against joint enterprise prosecutions. But before that, we're going to come on to something to do with basically police prosecutions of people stealing food, and a kind of rather extraordinary set of exchanges. I was quite surprised to see, I have to say, but it all started because last month one of UK's most senior police officers, the Chief Inspector of Police no less, Andy Cook, called on the police to use their discretion when faced with people stealing in order to eat. Speaking to The Guardian, he said that the police should consider what was the best thing for the community. Now, his comments prompted a rebuke both from Conservative and Labour politicians. The Home Office Minister Kit Malthouse told The Times that the police should enforce the law consistently. And the Labour Shadow Attorney General, Emily Thornberry, went even further, telling the paper, and I'm quoting here, "I can't say anything other than the law is there for a purpose, and it should apply to everybody equally. And if the law is broken, then it is up to the police to enforce that law." So, Claire, I mean, playing devil's advocate, or maybe at least just kind of articulating, I suppose, the point that Emily Thornberry was making, if we're going to live in a law-governed society, doesn't the law have to be applied consistently to everybody, regardless of circumstances? What do you think?
I guess my response would be that the law isn't applied equally to everybody. Without going off on a tangent, we only have to look at the likes of Partygate as a prime example of that. The law falls most heavily on the most powerless members of society.
Although the Prime Minister did receive a fixed penalty notice, I guess would be the argument.
Yeah, well, yes, but I think generally the sort of surveillance of those in positions of power with access to the top kind of legal advice and so on, it's very different that the way in which the law is applied to such people, compared if we talk about the haves and the have-nots. I mean, in the case of stealing food to survive, I'm on the side of compassion here. I think, if people can't afford to eat in one of the richest nations in the world, we've got a serious problem. We had food banks introduced that were supposed to be an emergency measure that have now become a standard part of our society, right? That seems to have just happened in recent years. I don't think the law is the answer to this. The answer is in trying to improve kind of the fundamentals of society, really, making sure everyone's got basic necessities for survival, that they don't have to make absolutely horrendous, stressful choices between whether they're heating their home or feeding their children that particular night, which is not difficult to imagine being in those positions, but knowing it's not fun to be counting your coppers at the end of every week and thinking, what can I afford? Dealing with precarious wages, dealing with our benefit system, which has seen profound cuts over recent years. These are the sorts of things that I think we should be focusing on, not using the law. Again, our research, although in a different context, shows how damaging unnecessary criminalisation can be, and how damaging giving people criminal records for things that might be dealt with in a different, more socially just way can be as well.
I mean, I think one of the things that really struck me about it was how it, it kind of appeared that, a senior police officer was kind of articulating a rather more progressive and compassionate position on this issue than two senior elected politicians. And I guess that, most police officers, I mean, we've just been talking about, some of the most grotesque abuses of police power in terms of undercover policing. And in previous programs, we've talked about, police racism, police misogyny. I don't think anybody has any illusions that there are some serious, deep systemic problems within the policing system. I also suspect that probably most police officers didn't go into their line of work in order to arrest and initiate the prosecution of poor members of the public who are just stealing food to get by, to survive, you know, to feed their children. So I just kind of wonder, Mark, maybe you have some thoughts on this. You know, the police, it feels to me, you know, without wanting to overly defend the police, and I'm often one of their biggest critics, it does feel as though the police are being put in a rather invidious position here of kind of being expected to enforce the law that I suspect many police officers themselves feel is kind of very unfair.
Yeah, yeah, it's about, I think, the way that the government send out the metrics, right, about performance and stuff is one of the really big problems here, because what you've got is a group of people that are measured on arrests and arrests, etc. And I'm not sure whether my signal is stable.
It's a bit flaky, but we should have said Mark is joining us on a mobile signal today.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit, but carry on, please. Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, so the way that the metrics get pushed down, so the stealing for food is the same as begging for money for food. Do you know what I mean? Like it, and then you get arrested through the, you know, the Vagrancy Act. Well, it's not even the Vagrancy Act, because it's about with begging, it's different. It's you get arrested for non-compliance with an order to move. And you're in this catch-22 that if you move, you don't eat. So if you, do you know what I mean? Like you get arrested, and then the police are saying the arrest, or we've arrested this person 17 times, to literally just join this loop, where actually when you're experiencing poverty, the consequences that you and I have in a civil society are absolutely just not even a consequence for somebody that's experienced poverty. Because what happens, you get arrested, you go on this merry-go-round, you go to the police cell, you see the doctor, or you get a meal, you go to prison, you get 3 meals, and actually for some people that existence, that subterranean existence, is better than the alternative of starving, or, you know, or being in complete chaos and hopelessness. And what you've got is this like feeding frenzy by the state to get the numbers of arrests, you know, and they're working on arrests. And so we've done a piece of work for the police inspectorate. In fact, we're just about to start another one, but we've done one around the lack of skill that police have got they are the default mental health service in this country. Okay, they do not have any training or assessment tools to assess who they're looking at around neurodiversity, yeah, mental health. They don't. And so it literally you get put in this concertina. Then you go to the courts. The courts are reliant on probation services to do a report, for instance. Probation don't have any assessments tools robustly. There is a bit of momentum now it's about assessment, not referrals or understanding of what these conditions are. It's just literally an assessment. So all of a sudden you go from community, social disadvantage, get the guillotine of the police who are chasing after this moral choice to commit a crime, to then the courts who are literally, let's face it, they're not, the magistrates' courts are not reflective of the communities that we live in. And actually some of the other stuff they're coming out with increasing the length of sentences by volunteer magistrates is really worrying as well, right? Then you go to get sentenced, they can increase sentence out to 18 months, right? You go to prison where you get long behind the door and you're getting out and they're monitoring the likelihood of you doing the same thing again. It's mad.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've expressed very well the interconnection of the whole system. So it's not even just in this case people who steal food in order to survive being arrested, or, you know, as you say, they then can be the beginning of a long journey.
But these are state regulated bodies, and in that state regulation, their landscape is cut down to a very narrow view. And then we have this discussion in this narrow view. But what we're talking about is human beings that are telling you, and Claire said it absolutely rightly, of this rich information about this lived experience and this journey. And it's the state regulated silos that are the problem.
And the kind of, in a sense, then the broader issue here about, you know, basically if poverty is the problem, then is it really the problem of the justice system to sort out? And as Claire was indicating, you know, we need a rather more holistic and systemic approach, not least of all just making people sure, making sure people have enough money or to actually put the food on the table, you know, which doesn't seem like an unreasonable expectation in one of the richest societies in the world. There's a comment here by Malcolm, who I think makes, I mean, in a sense, really making a similar point to you, Mark, in a slightly different way, that, you know, that actually just because someone's being arrested, it doesn't mean that they need to be diverted, you know, need to be pushed forward to prosecution and conviction. You know, there are opportunities for diversion there, and other kind of flagging up of services. I think, as we know, a lot of services are finally stretched at the moment. And Charlie's just asking about where the article is. So we'll certainly make sure in the follow-up email to all those who've attended, we'll include a link to the article. Bear in mind that it's the Times, so it is behind a paywall, but I think there are various devious and clever ways of getting around the paywall. I won't advertise them, but I'm sure people can work that out for themselves. Okay, look, let's move on to the next item. I think it's fairly clear from the panelists who've spoken, and you know, that it does seem a bit of a ridiculous and rather heartless situation to be in when people are being potentially arrested and prosecuted for trying to get by, you know, and hopefully, you know, things might change in the future, but let's not hold out too much hope in the short term on that. We're going to move on to the question of the prison education system. In a report published last month, the House of Commons Education Select Committee found prison education to be in, quote, a poor state following a long-term decline in both the quality of education and the number of prisoners participating in learning or training. 6 years ago last month, a major review into prison education, the Coates Review, argued that education should be at the heart of the prison service. And yet 6 years later, the Education Committee reported, "We are concerned this aspiration has still not been realised," which is, I suppose, rather polite parliamentary language. Now, the Conservative chair of the Education Committee, Robert Halfon, did go further in his remarks. He said that prison education is in a chaotic place. There's a shambolic transfer of records, no assessment for educational needs, and the lack of access to modern learning tools add up to paint a dismal picture. Mark, what is prison education for? The committee, for example, highlights a significant decrease in the number of prisoners studying for courses equivalent to AS levels or above. But it also points out data showing that over 30% of prisoners have learning difficulties or learning challenges. So is the issue partly that the prison system is dealing with a very mixed clientele, as it were? You've got a lot of prisoners who literally can't read, and then you have other prisoners who maybe want to study open university degrees, and trying to cover that breadth of demand, even within a system that's properly funded, which we know it's not, is always going to be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. Okay, so, I mean, I think of it at 100,000 feet, right? First, what is education? And what is the priority of education to a volatile criminal that has to go to prison to be confined and removed from society? That's number one, because this debate has been had over here in political echelons and the very middle class version of it. You know, you said it about the police, that people know the moral choice of, there's no mitigating circumstance, there's no moral confusion of a kid who grows up in chaos. When they commit a crime, you know, their family literally supports some crime. The police don't, you know what I mean? They enter this system. And we judge this group with our own morality about maths and English and education. So is that the priority of, let's say, a violent offender who can't literally navigate his own life without punching somebody in the face or stabbing one of his peers? Do you know what I mean? Like, and then we go, oh, you need to learn English and maths, and or you need to go on a bricklaying course and you learn to this. And then what's the evidence historically through British prison of this having impact on offending? The reoffending figures have been stagnantly high throughout history, and we've pretty much done the same thing. So I can't talk about that without kind of challenging the whole umbrella of what we see as education and how we judge our own morality, and try to regurgitate that view onto this group of people. Yeah, like I'm sure the public will want to know that that person is challenged about their crime, like almost every day that they're incarcerated. But this is the thing with the public. What that report sort of says is prisoners potentially don't want to engage with education. It's ridiculous. Prisoners are confined. It's a systemic error which causes that figure. It's the prison governors and the actual ability to deliver an offer to people taking it up. Not prisoners don't. It's like TV in prisons. You know, people say, "Oh, prisoners have got TV." You think that prisoners have chosen to have a TV? It's not. It's the system that does it. So we need to challenge like the whole concept of it. Around education, for me, as I've just said, it's a poor psychological predispositions which cause crime. Fact. Honestly, I'm testament to that. That's a fact. Throughout this system, there is literally negligible opportunities to even personally inquire or reach the point of self-honesty in order to recover or rehabilitate. There's no opportunities whatsoever to do that. So then when we're looking at education, I agree, you know, that learning Maths and English will help you to navigate, but it's not the priority. When you look at the system, and I'll shut up on this, but when you look at the system of education in prison, one of the things that have come from this policy, this top down, is purposeful activity. Now, this is in this new regime, this recovery strand, and that you can't get a job without doing a basic level of English and Maths. English and Maths pay less, your education pays less than what you would do for sweeping the prison wing, right? So if you want to, where I said it's like, it's not prisoners' fault, it's a systemic errors which often cause this thing of going, you can earn more money cleaning a prison wing than you can go attending a Maths and English course or progress. That's one of the issues. That
I think one of the really striking things you're saying there, Mark, is I think challenging us to, you know, think rather more broadly about what education is, you know, and what we mean by education. So, you know, that you're one of the organisations also in the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies building, Safe Ground, do amazing work in prisons, working around issues around masculinity, emotional literacy, you know, helping exactly do that kind of as a creative, arts-based, therapeutic work with prisoners. And, you know, like lots of organisations in their situation, finding it very difficult even to get into prisons to do that delivery at the moment. Meanwhile, we have reports like this, as you say, kind of more or less indicating that what we need to do is just get prisoners sitting behind desks, you know, learning their ABCs, because that will help them get a job. But as you say, if you can't get, you know, if you're finding it difficult to get through your day without punching someone in the face every time you're angry, you're unlikely, even if it is a good idea to learn to read and write, that's probably not really your priority. And I think that's just a really...
And now coming out of COVID, so even the education, training and jobs courses are back, but at extremely reduced capacity. Right, so even if it's like this term purposeful activity now is almost they want to put it in education. You know, like what's the purpose of talking to somebody about your mental health or you're having a cup of tea? That's not a purposeful activity. Yeah, so the purposeful activity is like Maths and English and this performance score of being able to do that. So lots of prisoners are back 2 days a week for an hour. So can you see what this has come down, and the world is getting the view of this. Yes, education should happen, but yet when you look at the reality of it, they're all out of date. Prisons will not go back to what they were 2 years ago. That's a fact, and like everybody involved in it needs to acknowledge that. They won't go back to it. So this is what the report says, we need to really talk about criminal justice now, because these state institutions are running away. You talk about Safe Ground, you know, look at the third sector who do this type of what they say soft skills and soft education. It's not, it's the most critical side. They're now being literally removed through government funding. You know, where government funding, I think Kingston report, where the 100 grand for rehabilitation services have predominantly gone to private sector, above £10 million turnover. Yeah, we're just moving into this very lean business that literally isn't impassioned or activist or has a really specific skill set and expertise over reducing reoffending. They're just delivering like literally what the top down is saying.
It's a very it's a very kind of transactional view, isn't it? Really, a very narrow view. It's the 3 R's, isn't it? Reading, writing, and arithmetic. I never really quite understood why arithmetic was one of the R's, but anyway, reading, writing, arithmetic, maybe. All right, look, we're quickly running out of time, so I think we should move on to our final item on joint enterprise. But thank you, Mark. I think that was a really, really fascinating and really significant collection of reflections and thoughts, on just how much we're narrowing our vision when we think about education as merely being effectively kind of formal learning in a kind of a classroom kind of mentality. So thank you so much for those thoughts. It's really helpful and really valuable to kind of have those I think kind of articulated in the way that you did. So let's move on to our last item on joint enterprise. So some 100 family members and campaigners met at Parliament on May the 16th for an event organised by JENGBA, which is Joint Enterprise Not Guilty by Association. Those who've attended some of our earlier programmes will be familiar with some of the people behind JENGBA from some of the programmes who've been on some of our earlier editions. The Conservative MP, Andrew Mitchell, reminded the audience that good campaigns often take a long time to achieve their objectives, and that this should not put them off. Among other MPs attending were the former Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer and former Shadow Home Secretary, John McDonnell and Diane Abbott, respectively. And indeed, there were about 10 or 12, 15 MPs there. So quite a good representation of parliamentarians who are very concerned about this issue. Our head of programmes, Helen Mills, who's the lead author of a report that we published back in April, called The Usual Suspects on Joint Enterprise Convictions, was one of the speakers at the event. And again, I'm delighted that Helen's able to join us today to reflect on that event and also look forward really to where the campaign against joint enterprise convictions and prosecutions might be headed. Helen, let's just start with joint enterprise itself. Is it, I mean, we've talked about this a lot. I've been in situations people talk about joint enterprise. Is it possible to define precisely what joint enterprise is?
All right, it's a good place to start. So joint enterprise is a colloquial expression used to describe the doctrine of law that enables more than one person to be prosecuted in relation to the same incident, despite or even when they have very different roles in that incident. Now, I think where some of the difficulties in this field come in is that these laws have been around since Victorian times, and some of their use is very uncontroversial. So, it's possible to plan and carry out a crime in a group. So, of course, they should be prosecuted in that way. Where these laws have become controversial is their low threshold for use and concern around peripheral people who have been relatively peripheral or bystander in an event, particularly violence and manslaughter and murder, kind of basically public violence incidents, can be prosecuted on the same basis as a secondary. It's called secondary liability, but they would receive potentially they are sentenced on the same basis as a principal offender, as the person who dealt the blow, held the knife, fired a gun. And the second way in which they're controversial is because of the way that they're used around so-called gang prosecutions and the kind of very racial narrative around that. What our work was showing is the exaggerated rate at which people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds are prosecuted as a secondary suspect for murder and manslaughter, particularly actually those from the Black community and young Black men and boys prosecuted at an exacerbated rate. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I've muted myself. Right, thank you. So I kind of think that sounds like it's a very kind of grey area in terms of it's, you know, it's not quite like trying to lasso a cloud, but it's quite difficult nonetheless to get hold of, you know, because it's not in this situation. If someone is facing a prosecution in court, that they will, you know, the prosecution at the particular moment will say, Your Honour, we are prosecuting this person under the joint enterprise doctrine. So people can effectively be convicted under joint enterprise rules without knowing that those rules are being applied.
Indeed, and indeed they are. This is something that's been found in prisoner surveys. The way those surveys are, you know, constructed is partly about trying to help people understand the basis on which they were convicted, because they might not know they were convicted under a joint enterprise law. They might not know they were convicted as a secondary suspect in an incident. So yeah, no, indeed, people don't know the basis on which they're convicted. I mean, the reason that you know, and I presume we might have talked about this before in these previous events, is where there's been, you know, supposedly one of the most significant changes in the legal landscape is the way that you can be prosecuted through joint enterprise is aiding and abetting, but there was a second way, and that was something called parasitic accessorial liability. So up until 2016, what that meant basically was if you commit a crime, you know, with another person, and one of the people you are with goes on to commit a different crime, you can be held liable for that other crime that they commit, even if it was not, you know, planned or explicitly spoken about, on the basis that you should have or could have had foresight for their actions. So that has been one of the most controversial areas. And then in 2016, the Supreme Court said no, that the law had misinterpreted that, overinterpreted that. In fact, you can't be convicted on that basis, but it can still be used in evidence against you. So now that you can use that in evidence, but you have to prove there was aiding and abetting as well.
I have to say, I mean, I've kind of wrestled with joint enterprise issues on and off over the years, and every time I kind of hear about it, it just makes my head hurt. Actually, I just can't quite get it just seems so confusing. And on the one hand, you know, sure, if I rob a bank and someone else is driving the getaway car, then I guess it's fair enough for them to be prosecuted too. But this idea that you can be in a different room in a house, and meanwhile someone's having a fight with the owner, however awful that might be, I hasten to add, you know, and suddenly you're being done for murder, even though you didn't even realise that your co-offender had a knife with them, and certainly you didn't yourself break into the house with the intention of killing anybody. It does seem like a really kind of just, I don't know, a strange situation. Claire, does it make your head hurt as well?
It absolutely does. It's not something I could claim to have any expertise in, but what I've read, it's just hard to get your head round how this is actually still happening. Actually, I mean, I think looking at sort of some of the earlier really powerful work, sort of dangerous associations and that racialization around joint enterprise, and then more recently, I was reading the work of Becky Clark and Catherine Chadwick on the stories of injustice and on women, and again to bring us sort of back to where we started almost, thinking about sort of some of those intersections and women and ethnicity and so on. Absolutely incredible. Reading some of those things, I've just made a note here. Nearly half the women in the study were serving life sentences. Most convicted under joint enterprise engaged in no violence. I mean, that really is hard to get your head round, and how, given since the Supreme Court ruling, that we've not seen more change. Actually, again, I think in a number of the topics we've talked about, the pace of social change is frustratingly slow, and this is one that the evidence seems just incredibly powerful and clear that we do need change.
I mean, Richard, you mentioned being in a different room. What I would say is the sort of, you know, anecdotal but also very sort of detailed look at individual cases and the use of social media to prosecute more than one person if that is proving evidence of a gang connection. So in terms of kind of, and I agree these issues can be kind of abstract and all a bit legally, a podcast I'd recommend listening to if you are interested in trying to get your head around these issues, called Surviving Society, and it is about the case last month of 10 boys in Manchester who've just been convicted of a joint enterprise murder. They're due to be sentenced this month. But Roxy from Kids in Colour goes into detail about the use of social media to establish that was used by the prosecution to establish this was a gang-related event, something that's disputed.
We'll share that link with everyone who's attended today after the programme. Thank you for that. We need to finish fairly soon, but Helen, just tell us, the event in Parliament was partly to kind of launch or to kind of push some new initiatives. So just sort of in a few words, really, what's next? What's coming up really in relation to the campaign that Jengba have been leading so doughtily over a number of years now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's multi-pronged at this stage. So three main things that I think are on the books at the minute is one about injustice around past convictions. So that period in which the law is now acknowledged to have taken a wrong turn, there's only been one successful appeal. And Jengba argue that's because of the high barrier of the substantial injustice test. So there's a parliamentary request for a parliamentary bill to remove the substantial injustice test. And if people are interested, that's something you can write to your MP about. If you look at Jengba's website, they'll explain how to do that. There's also current practices, clearly ongoing issues there. And as we say, not enough done, not enough change in the ground in terms of the scale and the use of these laws. So we, alongside Jengba, are calling for a parliamentary inquiry into this issue and continuing to ask questions in Parliament, amongst those concerned about the use of these laws. There's also the question of data. Now, our report was data-based. It was through Freedom of Information requests, looking at the closest approximations we could get to joint enterprise. But going back to 2014, the government said that they would look to improve data around joint enterprise. There's been no public release of data since that point. So we are supporting the legal case that Liberty are currently bringing against the CPS for them to release data on the basis that there are significant equalities questions actually about the use of these laws, which they have a public duty to better understand so that they can stop those practices.
Thank you. We're out of time. These programs always whiz by in a blink of an eye, and then we're done. And today is no exception, and it's in no small part down to the excellent panelists we've had today who've kept us really interested. So thank you to Claire, Mark, and Helen for giving us so much to think about and to talk about. This, as I mentioned at the beginning of the programme, is the last in the current series of last month in criminal justice. We're going to take a bit of a break over the summer. But we're planning to launch a new series in the autumn, and in the meantime we're having a bit of a think about this format. So we're going to be sending out a link in the next few days to everyone who's attended today, and indeed everyone who's attended any of the last month of criminal justice programs over recent months, to ask you for your thoughts and feedback. What do you like about these programs? What do you not like about them? Are there things that you think we should change, or particular new innovations we should introduce? We'd love to hear your thoughts on that. You can do, if you want to share your email address, then we'll also get back to you. Certainly to thank you, we may follow that up. You can also share your thoughts anonymously if you prefer to do that. So we'll be sending the link round about that in the next few days. In the meantime, later this month, on the 22nd of June, we'll have the next in our Lunch With programs, and that will be with Katuna Sinsadze from the Zahid Mubarak Trust. So very much looking forward to that program. But in the meantime, thank you everyone who attended today. Thank you those who made a donation on registration. We always keep these programs free, but they're not free to run. So we really appreciate the financial support that we get from those who feel able to make small donations on registration. So thank you for that. And as I said, this is the last of this current series, but very much hope to see a number of you in the autumn, when we will be coming back with hopefully last month in criminal justice. I don't know what we'll call it. 2, the New Hope. Let's see. But hopefully a new program, a bit jazzed up and with some more features. And your thoughts on how we can improve them would be great to hear in the meantime. So thank you very much, and goodbye for now.